You're listening to Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right, well, hello, everybody. I'm Eric Vansel.
And I'm Daryl Sanders.
And we're your hosts for this show. And, of course, yesterday was May the 4th. May the 4th be with you, right? Today is Revenge of the 5th.
Yes,
so,
this is the May.
You know, it's funny. There was a lot of people at work today. By the way, Paula subscribed, by the way. I don't know if I told you that or not.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, she saw, I sent her a couple of the shows yesterday, and she thought they were really good, so she subscribed. So that's cool. So hopefully, everybody follows Paula's example and hit that subscribe button. And then, of course, hit the like button, if you're watching it and you're feeling generous on a Friday the 5th. But it's funny, a lot of people brought up to me, and we missed an opportunity. They're like, we're surprised you didn't do a special show last night because it was May the 4th. I'm like, yeah, that was a missed opportunity, I admit.
Yeah, we kind of thought about it, but then we kind of want to keep everybody on schedule, especially, if May the 4th would have been like,
like a Wednesday or
something.
Yeah, exactly, right.
That would have been cool because then we still can do our Friday show, but our Friday show and our Monday show, it's kind of like right there. So,
yeah, no, that's a good point. And not to mention the fact that even though, on one hand, you could make the argument that doing a special May the 4th show might be cool. It's kind of an unofficial holiday. It's not like it's really, marking anything. Other than this year, we could have talked about the 40th anniversary of Return of the Jedi or something. That's probably what I would have done if we had done a, like a special thing. Or Carrie Fisher getting her star. Yeah. There was a couple of things in the news that we probably could have done or whatever. And certainly if you guys, over the course of the evening, you want to talk about that, you can chat in, whatever. It's not like we're limited to the topic at hand. It's just that's more or less what, it's our plan. So that's what we're going to launch off. And if nobody chats, which has happened before, then obviously that's what we're going to talk about. But if you guys, I don't know, if there's something that's really on your mind about Star Wars or whatever, feel free. There have been a couple of shows that really digressed from the original topic. Like a half hour later, we're like, yeah, maybe we ought to get back to what we were talking about. But tonight, we're actually talking about, so there's this article that you sent from The Wire, I think, thewire.com, if I'm not mistaken. And it was basically talking about how this new group of shows and movies or whatever is going to change everything. So what exactly did you get out of this article? What was it really talking about in your mind?
Well, here's the thing. We're in a different place once again with Star Wars, where, the sequel trilogies are completed, thankfully. And now we're kind of in this space where we have a lot of TV shows that are going on, but then now Disney / Lucasfilm has announced that, a celebration that there's at least that we know there's 3 films that will be in the process of becoming completed, and that will be presented to us. So once again, we're in a place in time where, because remember, after the prequel trilogy, we kind of figured there was going to be really no more Star Wars after that. And then we got the sequel trilogy, but we really didn't know where that was going to take the franchise. We didn't know if that was going to, launch it in a completely different direction, which in a way we kind of are, because that's one of the films now post the sequel, what that's going to cover.
There's another thing you can look at too, though, going back to that, because that's very true, is that we were in this kind of no man's land of, it was kind of the end of Star Wars. Ronaldo chats in. He says, hello, my Celestian army. It's funny how Ronaldo always finds a different Star Wars related greeting.
And a different group for us to be a part of. We are Ewoks and Wookiees.
Right, yeah, exactly. I guess it just depends really on what's going on or what. So, kudos to you, Ronaldo, for coming up with these really brilliant greetings that you do every week. The other thing I should mention before I finish my point is that we do have We do actually have a poll in the chat. So if you guys want to click on that, that's cool. Now, of course, as always, the Chad. I'm late. I went back and had to hear you say Revenge of the Fifth. Well, we did. We even addressed the whole thing about why we really didn't do a May the 4th thing. So you might want to, go back and check that one out too. But I think that you're right. After the prequels, there was definitely like this no man's land of we weren't going to get any more Star Wars. We weren't really sure what was going on. And then if you remember, right when we got used to it, then there was this whole announcement that the Clone Wars was coming out, and they actually put the first 2 episodes in the theaters that you and I, of course, saw, and were just beside ourselves because we're like, man, I can't believe we're actually going back to like a theatrical experience, even though, and even to that end, I mean, Christopher Lee was voicing Dooku, and I think Samuel Jackson was doing Mace Windu, and that only for that. I mean, obviously it was different voice actors for the actual series, but that was kind of like the reintroduction of Star Wars in the films, at least as far as the theatrical experience goes. And I think you're right. I think that now we're there again, even though it's a little different because at that time, like you said, there was definitely a situation where Lucas had announced, hey, there's no more Star Wars ever. It's done. I mean, not until I'm dead. And even then, he had like supposedly all these things in his will about, how they can't do anything for like decades or something. I mean, we would have been dead before another Star Wars film had come out at that point. And then, of course, we got the whole announcement that Disney bought Lucasfilm back in 2012 and, A New Hope began, if I may make that pun. Yes. So, yeah, you're definitely correct that now we're sort of back in that headspace again.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is we kind of go through different periods of time where we don't know, okay, what's coming from Star Wars. We kind of backed away from the films for a minute, and we started having a lot of TV series, so to speak, where we start having The Mandalorian, Andor, Book of Boba Fett. So now that became our medium, really, for Star Wars. That became our new playground for a little bit of time. And so we always kind of wonder, like, okay, we've heard things about Patty Jenkins, her whole plan to do a Star Wars film, and we've heard about Taika Waititi's plan to do stuff, and things haven't quite always made it to the big screen, and we've always kind of wondered, and we've often said on the show, especially you, Eric, Star Wars is a theatrical experience. That's kind of where that's where it lives. This is how people come to know Star Wars. So that's where people love to consume it. It's nothing like getting the family together or your friends or whatever and whatnot and going on a Saturday, evening or Friday night and checking out Star Wars. So now we're in a place where we're getting new content. Now, I remember there was a time when we found out, and we often kind of revert back to this moment when we found out, hey, Eric, did you know they're making new Star Wars movies? This is when I realized that they were doing The Force Awakens and they're doing like a whole new trilogy, right? So we're like, well, no, we didn't know that was even coming or even possible. So now we have the whole sequel trilogy, which to varying degrees were successful. Right. And we just covered all of that, if you haven't seen that, please, not now, but later, go back and, check out those episodes. But so we get to that point where we have The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, Rise of Skywalker. So now that that's complete, it kind of left Star Wars fans kind of in with mixed emotions. Now there's severe holes in the Star Wars armor. Before there were little chinks, but now just severe holes in the Star Wars armor. And so the television series or the Disney Plus series has done a pretty good job as far as trying to patch the potholes, so to speak, kind of put some and that asphalt down there and to kind of smooth things out just a little bit. But now that they're going to go back to the big screen, what is that going to look like now? Because now Star Wars fans are kind of skeptical, really skeptical. Like, all right, what is the new version of Star Wars going to look like? You know, what era are we going to cover? We kind of have a situation where they made the announcement at Celebration. We're going all the way back in time. Then there's another one where it's more or less the current framework in which we're running in, which is 30 year, well, right after Return of the Jedi period, between that and The Force Awakens. And then now we also have a film that's taking place 15 years after the rise of Skywalker. So it's kind of like a past, present, future almost kind of situation going on. But what is that going to look like for Star Wars fans? Are we excited about it? What needs to happen in these films to make us really want to go back and invest our time into Star Wars again? And that's pretty much what this article is about. It's really more so just capturing like what needs to happen for us as fans to really buy into Star Wars and even bring newer people into it.
Well, I mean, and I think while this is, of course, totally up for discussion for anybody watching right now or that wants to watch in the future and can certainly put it in the comments section, I think a lot of it is going to, and we've touched upon this in other shows recently, actually, because, you know, we talked about the cultivation of the Disney Plus shows and how maybe they can copy a little bit of Marvel's thing where they do, you know, maybe a bunch of the shows, like a season or two, and then it culminates into a crossover film. Similar to, okay, you have all the standalone superhero movies, and then the Avengers movie is sort of the cap on that phase, and then they move to another phase where, again, you have all the individual standalone films, and now you have the Avengers, the second, you know, like the sequel to the Avengers movie. That Avengers movie then caps off phase 2, and on it goes. Now, even though recently a lot of people agree, myself included, that Marvel's lost the way a little bit, and you know, we're getting a little bit of that superhero fatigue. Even though that may be the case, it doesn't necessarily have to be. Again, I think that Marvel's problem is the storytelling's not as good as it used to be. They're maybe trying to make too much content too quickly. They're not taking a lot of time. They're creating all these different, and maybe even splitting themselves up because they also had the Marvel TV shows. And I think that this is where maybe Lucasfilm can learn a lesson. Now, the franchise is, I mean, it's smaller in a way, but it could also be just as large because you have a lot of different characters, a lot of different stories, source material. I mean, that's one of the advantages of Star Wars, is that it's somewhat infinite in its possibilities. However, again, I think that maybe they were trying to do too much too quickly, and unfortunately, after the failure of Solo, I think they pulled the plug a little bit too quickly. I think they could have done the standalone films. I think that, one, the problem is the Solo one, that was maybe a poor choice of something to do as your second one. You know, because a lot of people, myself included, said, look, this is a movie that I'm not so sure we need. But even beyond that, it's like, okay, this is your second standalone film. And you actually had a really big success with Rogue One. Maybe if they had chosen some different subject matter or something, you know, it would have been okay. But they didn't. And then when that flopped, basically, at least for a Star Wars film, they were like, okay, no more standalone films. And then, of course, they turned their attention to the Disney Plus stuff because they were launching that platform, and The Mandalorian was sort of the flagship show for that new platform, which, of course, has been successful. And again, much like the films, varying degrees. You know, The Mandalorian got high remarks, Andor did. Book of Boba Fett, Obi-Wan, not so much. But still, people are generally warmer to that than they are the movies. The other problem with Solo, of course, is it only came like 5 months or something, or 6 months after The Last Jedi, which really began the whole thread of fan toxicity. So I think that moving forward, what they have to do is maybe streamline things. If they're going to do both the TV shows and the films, maybe make sure that they have adequate writers, staff, staff, directors, like just in general, so that they can do a really good job and maybe not bite off more than they can chew.
Well, that's kind of what I want to kind of delve into a bit, and I'm glad you brought it up. So we've often talked about on our shows, ad nauseum at times, that um, there's three aspects to the film production, right? You have the writing, the directing, and then the acting. Okay, and so to varying degrees, in Star Wars, sometimes it's been really good, and there's times that's been not so good. So let's just take for a minute. And by all means, everybody who may be watching at home, if you're catching the rebroadcast, still chat it in. What would you say out of the films? Would you say the writing, the directing, and the acting was spot on?
Rogue One.
The films, okay. Rogue One. That's it.
Well, you're talking about, I mean, like of every
all,
film?
all
Oh,
I
thought you were just talking about the Disney era.
No, I'm just talking about all of them.
Well,
Wow.
I mean, obviously, I would honestly say, without exception, A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, Rogue One. I might even be willing to throw Revenge of the Sith in there.
Okay.
Of course, Andor, if you want to actually push this into the television shows.
Okay.
I would do that. I mean, The Mandalorian, you could almost throw in there, but the problem with The Mandalorian is it's a little bit hit and miss. Now, of course, if David jumps on and sees the whole Andor praise, he's going to have a meltdown.
Of course.
But, by the way, and speaking of which, in our poll, surprisingly enough, out of Ahsoka, Andor Season 2, The Acolyte, and Skeleton Crew, right now it's 50-50 between Andor Season 2 and The Acolyte. So,
okay.
Again, if you guys are just, if you're just starting to watch now or whatever, or, well, I mean, actually, unless you're watching live, you can't participate in this poll, but you still have time, put your vote in there. I'm really curious. But the reason I bring this up is it does illustrate that Andor really resonated with a wide audience. Now, there were some people who were heavy Star Wars fans who it just wasn't for them, which is understandable because it was a little bit different. But it also cast a wider net, so people who would normally, they wouldn't even set foot near a Star Wars film really gravitated toward it. But if we're sticking with the films, then yeah, I would say, if you're talking about, really spot on direction, because again, you may be able to include more if you wanted to put, but I guess more like the individual attributes. But if you're really talking collectively, writing, directing, acting, you have to probably say maybe A New Hope and Empire. Because I could find a lot of problems with all of them. I guess in Rogue One, of course, I could almost put The Force Awakens in there too.
Okay. So what made those films? I know you, but what specifically, if you can think of something that really made like those films stand out?
Well, can I cheese out and say the writing, the acting, the directing?
Well, yeah, I know that's what we were kind of.
That's what we were talking about, right? Well,
right. Well, that's what I'm saying. But I guess like in that, like, okay, so let's just take, for example, you brought up Andor and you brought up Rogue One. Now, those two, even though Andor is really a series, not a movie, but you can almost view it as a film because it was basically shot like that, right?
And it kind of is almost a prequel to Rogue One, really.
Yeah. So those two have nothing to do with the Jedi and the Sith per se. with the exception of like, okay, Vader's cameo in certain aspects in Rogue One. All right, but we're talking about by and large, like
Well,
Rogue
and you're
One
talking
really
about a
the story.
focus. There's no
Yeah, the
focus
story
on
had
Vader.
the story was not focused on any of that. It was just more so. Why do you think that resonated so well, and what made it so good?
Star Wars. Well, I mean, I think what made it good is a couple of things, right? All right, first of all, you guys will have to forgive me. It's like my throat's really scratchy today, so I'm gonna be drinking fluids during this thing like no tomorrow. But I think that
Trust me, I'll be doing that doing Vision, so don't worry about it.
yeah, Ronaldo asked about that. I was gonna get to that when I start flying some of these chats through. But essentially, A New Hope established the whole Star Wars framework. I mean, it won a lot of awards and got a lot of attention and became a cultural phenomenon simply because everything was on point, right? Up until then, nobody had ever seen a science fiction film or sci-fi fantasy or whatever like that ever. I mean, there was a bunch of innovative filming techniques. There was, but I mean, even beyond all that, though, the characters resonated with people because they acted like real people. If you watch sci-fi films before that, it was very cold, clinical. People. I mean, it didn't even seem like they were acting. It just seemed like they were being. It just the whole human experience in that film just felt real. And then, of course, the blocking, the staging, the direction, everything was great. Now, of course, there is the famous story about how it was kind of a mess until George Lucas's wife went in and re-edited the thing. And there is a thing on YouTube. It's like a little documentary called How Star Wars Was Saved in the Edit or something like that. And so, but really that was more about pacing than anything else and just cutting out needless things. But the humor, again, it was more real. It was more human. It wasn't acted. Up until then, movies were acted, whereas that film really just showed people being people, like you could relate to them. And the characters, there was we brought this up too, I think when we did the review during our What is Star Wars series, where we talked about how everybody could see themselves in one or more of the characters. There was something there for everybody. So that established it. And then, of course, Empire Strikes Back basically took everything that was great about A New Hope and just put it on steroids. That's why everybody largely considers it the best sequel ever made. And then, of course, Rogue One really just has those same sensibilities. It's the things that made Star Wars great, the things that made it exceptional, the things that made it a cultural phenomenon. That movie essentially possessed.
I agree with you, in the sense of the films that you mentioned, as far as like, those were phenomenal films, and they were. And I think, we have to look at the roles though. And as I mentioned before, there's the script writing, the directing, and the acting. I think those things really, in order for any film, no matter if it's Star Wars or not, like that's going to be the formula, if you will. Now, the writing.